and different causes of epilepsy, and therefore we need to bear this in mind when taking things forward. But of course, the classification of the epilepsies is not new. It has been around a very long time. And it was in 1964 that the first proposed international classification was put forward in an ILAE Commission led by Gastaut. And then over the years, there have been various proposals put forward, very few of which have actually been officially acknowledged as a definitive proposal by the International League, but these have all been put forward. Various authors recognised as making a significant contribution over the years. As time has gone on, and since the very beginning, the dichotomy of generalised versus a focal basis for the classification of epileptic seizures has been recognised. And this really, the way the classification really came to the fore was following the development of EEG and our ability to determine that perhaps some seizures were focal and some seizures were generalised. These were patterns that we would see on the EEG, and therefore this concept was introduced very early at a time when classification was introduced. The dichotomy was also included in syndrome classification as that evolved over time. But also the syndrome classifications that came on also attempted to dichotomize according to etiology, according to cause. And certainly the terms idiopathic versus symptomatic have been noted over the years since the very beginning. So what is the purpose of the international classification of seizures and epilepsies? The primary purpose is to provide a common international language of terminology and classification, a precondition for comparability of results and research and therapy, and for meaningful exchange of ideas. It has always been, and will always be, primarily for clinical purposes, for treatment purposes, although, of course, research also requires a common language. The research into causes and mechanism are not a dominant focus of the classification. And I think what's illustrated is this is one of the first publications in 1964, a proposed international classification of epileptic seizures. And this, I think, is very, very telling. It is appreciated by the Commission that all attempts at classification of seizures are hampered by our limited knowledge of the underlying pathological processes within the brain, and that any classification must of necessity be a tentative one and will be subject to change with every advance in scientific understanding of epilepsy. And I think that was something that really resonated with myself when I went back over the history of the classification for lots of different purposes, and having been involved in recent discussions and recent debate. So as we move forward within the International League, the epilepsy syndromes came into existence in the 1985 and 1989 classifications. A syndrome defined as an epileptic disorder characterized by a cluster of signs and symptoms customarily occurring together. But again, even at this stage, it was recognized that some syndromes defied classification as according to the dichotomy that was in existence, namely symptomatic or idiopathic, because there may be both. And again, something that may not have been remembered from the publication of that unless amongst those who actually were involved in the discussion, in view of the fact that the ongoing debate and discussion that has gone on since then. And certainly they recognised at this stage that there may be insufficient evidence for definitive placement. So when the Commission at this stage introduced the classification, they divided the epilepsies into three, localization-related, generalized and undetermined. And of course, they had the terminology that we recognized at the time, that within each of these groups, namely the dichotomy between localization-related and generalized, and then undetermined, recognizing that it was not possible to dichotomize in all cases, the terms idiopathic, symptomatic, and cryptogenic relating to the definitive, to the suggested etiology, not the definitive etiology, the suggested etiology or cause. It did seem relatively simple. We could divide the groups of epilepsies into four: idiopathic generalized, idiopathic partial, symptomatic generalized, or symptomatic partial. But many patients could not be classified according to this, and there were places where it really did work, such as idiopathic generalized, with such syndromes as childhood absence epilepsy, or indeed symptomatic partial for temporal lobe epilepsies associated with hippocampal sclerosis, for example. But there are other situations where it did not seem to work so well. Idiopathic partial, supposedly for benign Rolandic, but there were many suggestions that maybe this wasn't a specific focal epilepsy, maybe there was more of a generalized concept to it. And other times, symptomatic generalized, such as Dravet syndrome, as this evolved in our understanding of this particular syndrome. On the one hand, there was a lot of cognitive problems, suggestion was underlying brain pathology, and certainly there were generalized seizures, but there were also focal seizures as part of this syndrome, and it was emerged that it was a genetic etiology, and therefore where did the term idiopathic sit with regard to this? There have been many, many scientific advances since the 1950s and 1960s when classification first started, not least with regard to genetics, whether it be genomic or molecular cell biology. Neuroimaging has moved strides in the past 20 years particularly. Neurophysiology and our ability to have video EEG and now also analyze the EEG in a much more detailed fashion from a digital format. And computational capabilities crossing all of these areas, and obviously also, as much as sometimes we don't feel we've moved forward, therapeutic options appear to be moving forward all the time, amongst many others. And therefore, it is apparent that classification or organization of the epilepsies does need to move forward with time. And in recognition of this, the Commission for Classification between 2005 and 2009 term were tasked with as the Commission for Classification is usually tasked, with the thought of re-looking at the classification and deciding, was it fit for purpose, should we be moving forward, how can we evolve the situation? And in fact resulted in this publication, which was titled A Revised Terminology and Concepts for the Organisation of the Seizures of the Epilepsies, recognising, should we really be calling it a classification when what we're trying to do is actually organise this into a framework. Ooh, hang on, I need to be patient. So, what this publication addressed and what had been discussed at length during that term within the Commission was the fact that classification or organisation is an evolving process and will never be perfect because of the constant changes in our understanding of the epilepsies. We need to keep in focus the clinical work, the contribution of this to clinical management, although we need to recognise that there's ongoing research and other areas where this organisation is going to be useful. The science is lacking to make it a true biological classification, as is understood in other scientific areas, and hence why the term organisation was used. But also, words matter. What you describe needs to have an appropriate meaning and an understandable meaning across the globe in different languages. And language and cultures will differ, and the understanding of different terminology will differ. And I think that has become very apparent over time. The seizures, of course, many of them are the same, but there are some new descriptions, absence with special features, with further devolved into different types of absence, and myoclonic now included myoclonic atonic. The words that you will notice, the word partial was changed to focal in order to try and be more descriptive, and it was emphasized, as had previously been suggested, that the term simple and complex should not be encouraged. There was no agreement as to where epileptic spasms should sit, whether focal or generalized, and therefore it was decided it should sit within a group on its own for the time being. It was recognized that generalized and focal epilepsies do not always work, the terminology of focal and generalized for the epilepsies. As for the syndromes, for the seizures, it was felt that it still worked but at the time, but for the epilepsies, it did not always work. And examples of discrepancies were included in such things as West syndrome, focal to secondary cortical dysplasia, where there was an apparent generalized manifestation associated with a clearly focal lesion, the EEG being very, very generalized. But there were also focal seizures associated with what would be regarded as diffuse genetic disorders, such as Dravet syndrome or genetic epilepsy with febrile seizures plus. But it was also suggested, although I don't think really picked up, where it did fit, then it was fine to use the terminology. But on the whole, it was discouraged. And I don't think it was picked up at the time. It wasn't a complete reorganization. The epilepsy syndromes remained. Age-related onset disorders, of which there are many different ones, but of course they all remain the same, some of which were listed in the paper as examples, but that didn't exclude others that were still ongoing and very true to be diagnosed. But the other main change was, of course, the etiologies. And the terms symptomatic and idiopathic were again discouraged. It's felt that the dichotomy into these groups were not particularly useful, and we should be defining etiology as it stood. Namely, genetic. At this time, they're divided into three. Genetic, the epilepsy is the direct result of known or inferred genetic defect, where seizures are the core symptom of the disorder. Structural metabolic at this stage were lumped into one group, a distinct structural or metabolic condition or disease present, and at this stage it was that the structural abnormality or the metabolic condition was the primary cause of the epilepsy. So at the time, even though tuberous sclerosis is a genetic condition, it was felt that the structural abnormalities were the cause of the epilepsy and therefore would be classed within this etiological grouping. But it was also suggested that we should have an unknown group. This is where most of the research would stem, most of the new findings would arise from, and we ought to just be upfront and honest and indicate that the nature of the underlying cause is as yet unknown. Be upfront that we don't know the cause of the epilepsy. This was the response to that organisation, a complete explosion. Namely, there were many people who were unhappy, maybe misunderstandings, and the need for ongoing discussion became very apparent. And we needed to listen to the community and modify the organisation, not completely change it necessarily, but modify it, listening to the comments from those who are actually using it. So following that, there was some refinements considered. We needed to be responsive to the feedback from across the globe. It was recognised that focal and generalised epilepsies were useful as diagnostic entities where appropriate, although they didn't always work. The organisation needs to be modified to reflect an increasing emerging group of etiologies, namely the three groups didn't totally work. There was a lot of discussion as to whether those were enough to describe the etiologies. There needed to be a reflection of the current understanding, and the language that had been utilised in the paper didn't always work globally either. However much we felt or it was felt that there was a definition of the English, it didn't always translate appropriately across the globe. It was consistently recognised, but perhaps not so apparent from what had been described, that there are different approaches to epilepsy diagnosis, and predominantly, yes, traditionally electroclinical syndromes described on the basis of their clinical features and electrical features and other contributions. But also, increasingly, there is an etiological approach, and there is a degree of overlap. Syndromes themselves may be the result of differing etiologies, and etiologies may present with what's not recognised as a specific electroclinical syndrome. The electroclinical syndromes, it has to be emphasised, have not changed. The diagnosis of an electroclinical syndrome can still be made as previously, such as Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or childhood absence epilepsy. And a diagnosis of electroclinical syndrome or a diagnosis of the type of epilepsy is not the same as a classification. But they felt there needed to be more expansion with regard to etiology, because the three subgroups alone that had been described were not enough. And therefore it was proposed that this was devolved out into further groups, and namely genetic remained, structural and metabolic were separated, but now, of course, with emerging science, as will become apparent also even within this session, there's immune, infectious, of course, being very much the major cause of the epilepsies in certain part of the world, but there still is a group of unknown. And this is, again, the area where much of the research probably will be undertaken so that individuals in this group, or type epilepsies in this group, move into each of the others. And it also is recognised that individuals may have more than one etiology. Tuberosclerosis, for example, may be structural, but it's also genetic, so could be called structural genetic. Glucose transporter deficiency, a genetic abnormality causing a deficiency in the glucose transporter, primarily responsible for taking glucose up across the blood-brain barrier. This is a metabolic condition, but of course has a genetic cause. And the autoimmune epilepsies, of course, have an immune cause, but also may have structural abnormalities to be determined, which may, of course, be related to causing the epilepsy. So they're structural immune. Just to give examples. When this refinement was written, not only was it submitted to Epilepsia for review, but it was posted online as part of the ILAE new process for position papers. It was posted on the ILAE website and comment welcomed from around the globe. And it was posted for 2 months with advertisement across the newsletters and across email blasts that we would welcome comment with regard to the refinement as written. And as it had been also submitted to Epilepsia at the time, there were 6 independent reviews that really needed to be taken into consideration. And as, again, would follow the new process with regard to position papers with the International League Against Epilepsy, a new task force was formulated comprising of some members of the old as well as new commissions for the new term commission, namely the 2013 onward, an epilepsia editor and members of the executive committee, representation from the executive committee. And further work would need to be taken forward, and it was recognised that it would need to be taken forward, taken all these comments into consideration and the reviews in order to move it forward again to develop a possible official ILAE position paper if appropriate. From the online posting, 128 people commented in this period of time from 43 countries. So we felt we did reach out to the ILAE community, and many of these 128 people were actually responding on behalf of organisations. And there were lots of congratulations and appreciation of the hard work, and appreciation that there had been an attempt to listen to the community and take these forward to a different stage. But also, as you can imagine, there were some very angry responses, including that we should start the whole process all over again. What was clear is that words matter, and the way things had been described weren't necessarily what had been understood by the community. The term genetic, even though relating specifically to the etiology and the cause of the epilepsy, appeared to have large social and psychological impact because of the implications of that terminology within certain communities, and a fear to utilise that terminology because of this precise case. There was a lot of discussion as to whether genetic meant what we had as idiopathic previously, or did idiopathic really mean more than that? The terminology of dyscognitive used to describe focal seizures and whether there had been loss of awareness or loss of understanding during a seizure led to huge debate and a discussion that the definition needed to be clearer. Using the 2001 glossary to determine this added to the confusion rather than aided the confusion, and that we needed to think, or there needed to be thought of a different word, or in fact to define it more accurately. What about the term benign? Should this be discouraged? What about the use of self-limited and pharmacoresponsive? And what about the meaning of generalized, whether it be related to the seizures themselves or to the syndromes? So these are actually very specific points, but it's just an example of what was suggested or where made it emphasized where some of the confusion lay, when words often were utilized to imply that there were positive and negative comments on the same point. The approach still remains the same. There are electroclinical syndromes and etiology. They're not distinct. There is a large degree of overlap, and they are complementary pieces of information to the puzzle. There were other suggestions that we need to take on board, namely that we need to define seizures more accurately. We need to discuss status epilepticus. The 2010 paper and the subsequent refinement did not take this into consideration, and indeed there has been a task force for status epilepticus working on a new classification for this. There was a desire to include reflex seizures. Where did they sit within the whole concept? And what about the issue about official ILAE syndromes? Should we have official syndromes, or should we just leave it that people can utilize them where useful? So there now is a new ILAE organisation task force. It's comprised of the authors of the 2013 refinement paper that was posted online, members of representing the ILAE Executive Committee, which of course includes our president, Emilio Peruca, and the epilepsy community, as well as an Epilepsia editor. At the present time, there has been further discussion, and it's recognised that everything starts with seizure types. But there needs to be a relook at the framework of which we work against. We need to recognise that the epilepsies may be described in various formats, and that still contributes to the overall diagnosis of epilepsy syndrome. But the concept of etiology, of course, is broad and crosses all across the whole framework. And something that has been repeatedly discussed and repeatedly there's been repeated concern about is where do the comorbidities sit in this? And surely they should also spread across the whole framework. Where are we now? There is going to be a commentary to illustrate where we're at, and that we're going to frame the approach and the roadmap that's going to take place over the next few years. There will be a controversy series for discussion in epilepsia. There's a classification of seizures task force to redress the description of seizures, look at the terminology, and try and get a common ground. Again, there will be an invitation for feedback. This should be an ongoing discussion with the epilepsy community. And ultimately, we hope there will be an updated classification of the epilepsies, which of course we accept not everybody may be happy with, but the global community on the whole will be able to move forward with. On that note, I wish to highlight one further point, and that is recently the Commission on Classification and Terminology of the ILAE have published a diagnostic manual online. This is the website. It is extremely useful. It goes through definitions of seizures with videos of seizures as they stand at the present time, the whole range of syndromes and other features, along with videos for which you may need to register, but this is only so that you are able to log in and view the videos. It is proving to be extremely useful, and what we need to do is get it utilised globally so that, again, it will contribute to common language. Thank you very much.